Listen, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5 has become unstuck in genre, which is a little bit easier than being unstuck in time, but worth discussing nonetheless. I have a complicated relationship with the late 60s anti-war novel by Kurt, Here is a Picture of My Asshole Vonnegut, but hey, so did Kurt Vonnegut. The first chapter is a non-fiction reflection on why and how he ended up writing the book in the first place. My relationship to the book is relevant because I'm about to post my spoiler warning, and I can't just bust out my regular warning, which says, hey, I'm gonna talk about the book, no holds barred. And I'd hate to spoil you, but it's really good, so read it. For one thing, it's debatable how much spoilers matter with this book specifically, since it's super meandering and non-chronological, such that there are only a few moments of specific setup and payoff that actually mattered if you knew about them beforehand. And for another, I'm not even sure I can recommend it in good conscience. I do think The Children's Crusade had a net positive effect on my life. And I also think that the feelings I had while reading are best summarized as a mixture of boredom, disinterest, and general discomfort. Seeing as I have a reputation for recommending fun, ephemeral things, I don't know if I really want this lumped in the pile. At the same time, I do think that by studying it, we can reveal something about the stuff I actually want to read. Yep, I guess that's our spoiler warning. Keep watching if you feel like it. You see, all those other things I recommend are fantasy, because if you haven't noticed, I'm a bit of a fantasy fanatic. A fantanatic, if you will. Wait, no, then I'd just be Brad Taste in music. It was actually because of those otherworldly aspects that my English teacher and I figured this would be a good book for me to read. Handmaid's Tale? One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Who wants to read that? Give me aliens or give me the protagonist of Terry Pratchett's Reaper Man. So it goes. But as soon as we each picked up the cool book about aliens, we had similar thoughts. Oh, Jay is not going to like this. Because despite the otherworldly alien content of the book, or perhaps specifically to spite it, the language used to tell its story is skillfully, masterfully boring. Let me clarify. During our time together, I let my English teacher force me to read a few books with a tone that I absolutely despise. Chief among these was The Executioner's Song, which turned me off of Pulitzer Prize winners harder than damn. Man, I hated reading it so much that I wrote a short 1,000-word essay when I was halfway through about how I wasn't gonna read a single— Wait, what was that? Speak up. Okay, we're receiving word that I actually picked that book for us to read during winter break because it sounded interesting from the Goodreads summary. That's on me. I called the tone of that book matter-of-fact because it was the only way I could describe the bland, boring slog that it was to read. But when it came to Slaughterhouse 5, that didn't come close to cutting it. I was driven by the power of 1,000 suns, for this time I would discover why it irked me so. The events of this book involve the trauma of battle expanded into a metaphor with aliens. Well, that's the premise of my favorite book in the world, so if it isn't the events, then what could possibly— It's the language. Now, these Jasontations are usually done in pretty broad strokes, not pulling out specific paragraphs and linguistic constructions unless it's to refute a particularly wrong article that opposes my opinion. This time, though, I think the devil is in the details. Take this passage, for instance. A little while later, they came out smoking cigars, talking contentedly in the mellow lower register of the German language. One of them saw Billy's face at the ventilator. He wagged a finger at him in affectionate warning, telling him to be a good boy. The Americans across the way told the guards again about the dead man on their car. The guards got a stretcher out of their own cozy car, opened up the dead man's car, and went inside. The dead man's car wasn't crowded at all. There were just 6 live colonels in there, and 1 dead one. The Germans carried the corpse out. The corpse was Wild Bob. So it goes. First of all, our protagonist, Billy Pilgrim, is removed of all agency. Instead of having an active voice, like Billy Pilgrim put his face up to the ventilator, he's found already there by someone else. The text doesn't show him moving, only being moved. In fact, the only people doing the moving here are groups of people. The Americans told the guards. The guards got a stretcher out of their cozy car. When an individual is moving, he's one of the Germans. The words always go out of their way to put every decision, action, or feeling in the hands of someone else, anyone else. Let's also note the use of commas, or lack thereof. I'm often accused of overusing commas, but that's because I write these scripts, and I need to know very specifically what cadence to say the words in. I want to be emotionally expressive, engaging in how I narrate my videos, so I add a lot of that clarification for myself. That's what commas do, broadly. They add a little bit of flavor along the way without using the big pauses, so leaving them out in several places makes the language monotone, bland, predictable. There's a repetition of phrases like the dead man's car, which just sells the immobility across the short sections. paralleling the repeated phrase, "so it goes," which carries it throughout the story. Then we have this short little sentence in the middle here that doesn't really mess with the rhythm, keeping it suitably stable. On average, the longest sentences Vonnegut uses here are still shorter than the shortest sentences I do. They're just broken up by more periods and long pause punctuation like em dashes. In fact, the entire flow of the book is broken up into weird chunks with their own beginnings and endings, more little subsections than I'd ever see in books I read in my free time. In a chapter of Worm, for instance, you'll get 2, maybe 3 little section breaks before the end, each one being somewhat self-contained. In the second chapter of Slaughterhouse 5, you get 25 individual sections, none of which last for more than a page, with transitions that can range from immediately related to tangentially related to seeming non-sequiturs. The pace of it is such that you have to be constantly switching gears, adjusting to this new line of story. You're never given the time and continuity to become all that emotionally invested in what's happening. I tried to write an emulative piece for Slaughterhouse 5, just one of these little sections. You could pause here and read it if you want, but if you get half as bored reading it as I did writing it, then you won't get past the 3rd paragraph. Hell, I didn't make it past the 5th. And that's why I'm talking about this book today. It's kind of the antithesis of everything I read and write. Which means, of course, that I can learn something about the thesis of what I love by comparison. I am the fantasy guy. I live, I love, and I laugh the stuff. But this has aliens, which are pretty fantastic the last time I checked, so what if this genre that I love so dearly can be broken down into 2 broad components? Ephemerality and bullshit. A book that's chock full of both would be Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. We'll call it the pinnacle of fantasy for now, if only to piss people off. It takes place in a world that doesn't resemble ours, has 5 different kinds of magic, and our storyteller is one of the Idima-Ru. Who wouldn't love it besides all those people on Goodreads? Bullshit is pretty self-explanatory. It's how much a given work pretends to be real life. Nonfiction really pretends it's what actually happened, so we'll call that low on bullshit. Realistic fiction's events are bullshit, but it pretends to be set in the real actual world, so it's still not that high on the bullshit. Piling higher from there, we have historical fiction, followed by hard science fiction, urban fantasy, isekai fantasy, and then our buddy Kavoth at the very tippity top. Theoretically, you could get higher if a fictional character was telling a story that was fictional even in the fictional universe, but that's that's a story for another day. Slaughterhouse 5 falls somewhere around here, pretty high on the bullshit-o-meter. So the reason I've read 1.3 million words of the Kingkiller Chronicle, but I've only read this book once, is its score in ephemerality. Fantasy is by nature dramatic, enchanting. I get sucked into Kavoth's story immediately and then binge it over the course of a weekend because I can't put it down. I'm jittery right now because I'm writing this instead of reading Pact by Wildbow. These stories capture terror, love, victory, woe, and whoa in their pages. All of the things that Slaughterhouse 5 eschews. High on the bullshit, low on the ephemera. To contrast, let's take a look at one of the few nonfiction books I can say I love reading, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. It's the exact opposite of Slaughterhouse 5. It claims to have all happened and is thus pretty low on the bullshit, if you take it at its word, but sweet scion, it's so high on the ephemera it probably snorted the stuff right before writing. I'll just pull a quick passage. About 20 miles east of Baker, I stopped to check the drug bag. The sun was hot and I felt like killing something. Anything. Even a big lizard. Drill the fucker. I got my attorney's .357 Magnum out of the trunk and spun the cylinder. It was loaded all the way around. Long, nasty little slugs. 158 grains with a fine flat trajectory and painted Aztec gold on the tips. Like, I'm just compelled to read that in a wild-eyed, dare I say, maniacal voice. Yes, the sentences are still short sometimes, but there's this great big long one at the end that really captures the rambly, off-the-cuff nature of it, as opposed to Vonnegut's concise, dry put-togetherness. The rhythm that Raoul S. Jerusalem Tom Duke creates with his placement and word choice is packed to the brim of his bucket hat with ephemera. And it helps that he's speaking in first person, never wandering off to some other viewpoint or piece of knowledge that distances us, the reader, from the main character. To contrast, I think that this is the passage that perfectly encapsulates what Slaughterhouse 5 is trying to convey. Next to Billy was little Paul Lazaro, who had promised to avenge Ronald Weary. Lazaro wasn't thinking about vengeance. He was thinking about his terrible bellyache. His stomach had shrunk to the size of a walnut. That dry, shriveled pouch was as sore as a boil. If I were the me of 3 years ago, making my first little writing notes document, I would have put all this shit under the never ever do section because I thought that writing was about doing the good things and not doing the bad ones. It isn't. Writing is more about doing the right things and not doing the wrong ones. Slaughterhouse 5 is an anti-war novel, or Vonnegut supposes it's an anti-war novel, and everything it does with its language serves to disillusion us from the ideal ephemerality of war. War isn't some fantasy about honor and righteousness. It has no valor, no monsters, or dynamic drama of battle. War has no heroes. This one had children. These ideals, like vengeance, exist only in abstract. You think of them after you think of your awful bellyache. And in that regard, soldiers on one side and soldiers on the other are pretty much the same. So I'm glad I read Slaughterhouse 5. I think it's taught me a lot about the stories I love most. It's a masterwork with just the right tone for what it's trying to convey, and dear God, I hope I never have to read it again. Now, if you'll excuse me, Blake Thorburn's about to confront the physical incarnation of an abstraction of conquest itself with a couple of ghosts and a hammer, and I really should be getting back to that. I'm Jay, and I hope to see you all later.